All right. And so we're going to begin on that list that we just saw. I'm going to go ahead and just quickly shift back to it. We're going to go ahead and skip to this segment at the very end right here. Go all the way down to the skull. The skull is the hardest part, so we're going to make sure to cover it first so you can have the weekend to actually understand what's expected and how to study for this stuff. And also, it kind of went well with our bone lecture today a little bit. All right. And so make sure I'm going to go in this order, so I'm going to kind of keep this handy. And so, when we look at the skeletal system, there will be no questions asking you how many bones do we have in the appendicular skeleton, how many bones do you have in the axial skeleton. There won't be any questions like that. They won't ask you how many are here, how many are here. This is just a nice overview of everything. Axial skeleton will refer to the skull, and will refer to the vertebra, and will refer to that thoracic cage. And so, let's get started. When we examine the skull is not one helmet, right? We all sort of imagine that it might look like a big, huge, like a helmet that just protects the brain, all one piece. But really, it's made out of individual bones that are connected or sewed on together or sutured together. And so we went over in lecture a little bit the parietal bone as an example, and then we saw the occipital bone. When we looked at our notes, they were examples of flat bones, right? Flat bones. And we went over these examples here. We went over the parietal, occipital, and then we talked about this joint here, this articulation. This is called a suture. And so these are those same sutures, and you can see that they're everywhere. And whenever there's a little bone that gets trapped in there, it was called a sutural bone. And so, and the head, or the skull, pardon, can be divided into two portions. It's divided into cranial, the part that's going to be housing the brain, and then there's going to be the bones that are not really in contact with that brain at all. They're going to make up what you know as your face, and that's why they're called facial bones. And so you really want to stay organized and start with cranial bones because it's the easiest. Facial bone starts off easy and then becomes terrible. And so that's probably what I would recommend best. And so with that, sorry, just reading through these. And so this is a nice split of those bones. And so occipital bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and frontal bone. Now, how to use our list and your notes. If you look at your list, you'll see that you have something along the lines like this. You have your occipital bone. Oops, I can't highlight on here. You have your occipital bone, and you have your parietal bone that we covered. And then I'm looking for the occipital bone is right there in front of me. Occipital bone, and again, parietal bone. Those are the examples we've seen so far. And again, these are going to be the bone markings found on this bone. This is the name of the bone. These are the bone markings. So an example of that, analyzing our occipital bone, is that if you look at the occipital bone, that's this entire orange portion on my screen here, this highlighted piece, and you'll see here you have the occipital condyle. This is an example of a bone marking found on this bone. And that's as hard as the skeleton is concept-wise. There's a bone, and then every single bone has features to it. And so that's what really the goal is to learn the bone names and then to learn their bone markings. You'll also see a type of question, and we'll go back to this list. You don't have to flip pages here, but you'll see here where it says the joint in italics. This is telling you exactly what bone it's going to meet with it. And so if we just quickly go to an easy one, and let's see if we can use our frontal. Let's stay with that. Occipital bone. You can see that the occipital bone has one in parentheses that says forms joint with C1 or atlas below. This C1 is the first bone of the vertebra. We know this as the vertebral cavity because inside of this bone segment is the spinal cord. But the first one, and what was the neck region called in anatomical regions? That's exactly what these bones are classified as, cervical. And so you already know that because you know the neck is cervical. The first bone, therefore, goes by C1, and then the next one goes by C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7. And so they go in that order that they use the first letter to sort of denote it. So now let's read this in parentheses one more time. The occipital bone, with its occipital condyle, forms a joint with C1. All it means is that it meets C1. It articulates with C1. And so if we look at our image here, you can see that our occipital condyles are right here. This is where that first vertebra bone would exist, C1. And so that's kind of why that list is sort of broken down in parentheses for you. And this is where it meets it. It forms a joint with it. Because remember the word joint and articulate are the same exact thing. And those words just mean one bone meeting another bone. And so you can see here, C1 articulates at the occipital condyle. So they might put little labels on this, and they might say, what is this bone marking? You would be answering occipital condyle. If they ask you, no, even if they had little stickers here, but they asked you ID the bone, what are you answering? Occipital bone. And if they ask you this, they put a little sticker here and it says forms a joint with, and then what are you answering? C1. And so that's the types of questions you're going to get. The last questions to address, which are going to be more relevant for appendicular, is that, and you'll see it in your appendicular video as well, that you can determine, when you have to determine which side is right or left sometimes. You will not always have to be given a bone and they're going to say, what is this? Is this left or right? You don't have to worry about left or right unless they ask you. The question will say, they'll have a bone there, and they'll say, is this a left or a right? And that's the only time you care about left or right. All right, keep it nice and easy, and that's what this last portion is. All right. And so back to our list, and your notes do have only the terms that you need, so they were edited out to have or remove terms that you do not need. And so let's stay focused on this PowerPoint slide. And so when we look at our occipital bone, it has, again, the bone marking occipital condyle, which is where C1 is going to meet it. And then you can see various sutures. This is the first view of the skull we saw in lecture. These sutures have names depending on their location. If it's on the posterior side or wrapped around the occipital bone, it's called the lambdoid suture, which is, again, just like this joint or this articulation between this bone and this bone. And you can see that there's going to be one on the lateral side that we're going to see in a little bit. And this is going to be called the squamous sutures, like squamous, right? Like our cells, squamous, but squamous suture. And if we go superior in the skull, we'll see we have the sagittal suture. And the sagittal suture runs on a sagittal line. And so let's look at that from a different perspective. If we look at the skull from the very top, you'll see here's our sagittal suture, and once more, our lambdoid suture at the very back, right, separating the occipital bone from the two parietal bones. And then we have this one that's called coronal, or also called frontal suture, just like the planes. Frontal suture or coronal suture. Pardon? Yes, you can use either one. And so it separates the parietal bones from the frontal bone, And something to have maybe slightly handy is that yellow packet I gave you of the skeleton. Sometimes there's going to be viewpoints. It has all the viewpoints that you're seeing, but it has it in black and white. And as an FYI, I will post something similar to this. I just want to make sure it's complete for your particular section. And where I'll actually label things for you on that yellow packet so that you can study these bones and bone markings. Where's the skull? Here it is. And so that way I kind of color-coded it so you can just study in a different way, or I gave it to you blank so you can do your own color coding and you can just double-check it against mine. So I'll probably post this maybe, in all likelihood, tomorrow around 7 p.m. I think I'll be able to finalize it then. Otherwise, you'll see this filled out for you. So you'll see all the views that you can see on the actual skull, so it's perfect to study with. All right. And so with that, even using my little list here, you can see here we have our frontal bone, and don't forget, you can also see your nasal bone. Even in your PowerPoint packet, you can see you have the nasal bone. All right. And making sure I didn't miss anything. Let's just keep going because some of them are better views from a spot. Let's keep going. And so this view is probably the one you're going to spend a lot of time on. We're going to see some common ones again, the bones, occipital, parietal, frontal. We see our sutures. Lambdoid was on the posterior side, And the squamous suture is going to be on the lateral side. And the coronal one is going to run a coronal plane. I don't know if that helps. Should help. And then we have our new bone we haven't discussed yet, the temporal bone. The temporal bone is going to have the markings known as the external acoustic meatus or the external acoustic canal. And so external acoustic or external auditory. That's all it is. Sorry, that's what I meant to say. External acoustic or external auditory. You can change this word for this one. Pick which one you like best, acoustic or auditory. They're both the same. You'll hear them both in different places. And so this is going to be what is essentially your ear opening. And this temporal bone has this complicated structure here on this surface here called the zygomatic process. Zygomatic process. And the reason it's called that is because if you look adjacent to it or next to it, you'll see the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone is what you've always known as your cheekbone. Your cheekbone. It even sort of makes the bottom or the lateral inferior part of your eye socket. And so this again is going to be your zygomatic bone. And so this process, the word process is sort of something that reaches out. And that's kind of a way of thinking about it, that if you were to isolate just this bone, it would have this sort of just sticking out from it, just sort of popped out. And so that is called your zygomatic process because it's heading towards the zygomatic bone. With that to that same effect, you can see here we have temporal process because it's this little segment that's going to go and try to aim to reach the temporal bone. So this one in orange would be the temporal process. I know it's labeled for you there, but sometimes it's easier to see it on the bone. And then this one would be your zygomatic process. Zygomatic process. So that trips students up all the time because temporal bone should have a temporal process, right? It's kind of, we make that mistake naturally. So you just want to make sure that you remember that it's the opposite names for the bone that they're meeting. That's probably the hardest thing on the superficial parts. This same temporal bone has this pointy little object, this pointy little portion, and that's going to be called the styloid process. You're going to see that word again. Styloid tends to be like a pointed end, kind of like a stylus. Pointed end. Yes, pointed end. And if we stay on this lateral view, you'll see the frontal bone doesn't really come with any new markings except this little opening here. I had mentioned a little bit earlier that the word foramen was going to come up. What did it mean? Does anybody remember what I had said? It means either hole or opening. And you will see it come up over and over again. Hole or opening. And in your boxes in front of you, if you can all now just go to the front of your stations. Each one has a blue box. Take it out and place it on your benches. And then be careful with it. Grab it from the bottom handles. There's 2 handles. And then open up the second one or find the bigger one. Open up the bigger one. And then you should be able to see a skull in there. Yes. And every table should have, every box should be for 2 people, unless, you know, you have your own box. Just kind of nice. Yes. And so what I want you to sort of do, or what I want you to do, is I want you to look up this very tiny hole opening right above the orbital, right above it. And from the front, it looks like this. Oops, oops, oops. It should look like this, these two little openings there. They may not be the perfect openings because your models might be fake, but otherwise most of the actual real skulls will have an actual opening right through there. And so, and you don't have any skulls?
She doesn't have a skull. I have it.
There's one in the very back there you can grab. You can bring it up to your station if you need it. And so this is if you think about the wording here, orbital implies the eye, supra means to run above. So this is like saying running above the eye, hole. So a hole above the eye. And so when you look at this segment here, these openings are on the skull. So these openings are there to allow nerve extensions from neurons to actually go and connect to the muscles. And this is why you can actually move the muscles up here, because nerves exit out of the brain and come out of this little opening and come to the front of the skin. You could even feel, right, if someone touches your forehead, you feel it because there are little wires on the surface that detect it and they send it. And you learn some of those wires. Let's review a little bit for your exam tomorrow. That if you look at your recording, when we went over the integumentary system, you learned about very specific receptors that are found underneath the skin. So these are the receptors, and they lead to the brain. So you can see that even now we're still learning how everything is sort of working together. These little nerve fibers will come out, and they'll reach your skin, and then when someone touches, you can feel that someone's touching your forehead here, your frontal region, because again, you have a lot of sensory fibers there coming out of those openings. And so you're going to see that a lot of these openings are going to be just to allow nerves to exit to the front of your face so you can feel things and control muscles. And so, supraorbital foramen. And so, let's see if I missed anything on this one. And so that was our frontal. We're progressing now more inferior. You'll see that you'll have your nasal bone. That's its own bone. Keep that in mind. Just because it's small, some students, I feel like they always confuse it for it being its own, like a marking, because it's tiny. But these bones can be incredibly tiny, and that's all you really need to be aware of. And so nasal bone is one of those examples. Another one that you can kind of see from the side is the lacrimal bone. And you'll notice that yours don't really have a lot of color. And so lacrimal is the Latin word to sort of imply tear. And so in Spanish, does anyone know what the word for tear is? Lágrima. And so this is where your tear duct is. So on your skulls, you should be able to see sort of a little opening right inside of that socket heading towards the nose in a way. Yes, it's inside. And so that's called the lacrimal bone. But like as written right here, lacrimal bone. But the actual little groove that's there is called the lacrimal groove. Nice and easy. Lacrimal groove is a bone marking of the lacrimal bone. And then don't worry about ethmoid on this viewpoint. It's a little crazy to understand that one. We'll get to the hard to understand bones at the end. And then you have your mandible, which is going to be your lower, what makes up your mental region or the chin. And so it's going to be your lower jaw. This is what's elevating up and down for you to chew. And the upper jaw has, or the upper portion of your jaw has its own, it's made out of its own bone called the maxilla. And so if we examine these from the anterior view, because it's a little bit easier, you can see you have your mandible at the very inferior portion. And then you have your maxilla, and the maxilla, don't confuse it for the mandible. The mandible, if you notice at the very bottom, has only one piece. That's all of it. Has one piece. This is one piece entirely. You can probably find or see it on your skulls. This maxilla is two pieces. 1 and 2. Two different pieces. Two different pieces. And so the maxilla has a very easy to remember function because we saw we had the supraorbital foramen, and here we have the infraorbital foramen, which means sort of to run below. And so if this is our orbital, then above, supra, below, infra. And so foramen again means opening or hole. You can see the nasal bone a little bit more conveniently now. And then this segment that's here, it's actually what's made out of cartilage, especially hyaline cartilage. I told you to scratch it off of your bone portion, but that's why we kind of needed to understand, or kind of was a little hesitant to. But otherwise, you'll notice that all your skulls have this huge opening here, and the rest of it, the part that protrudes forward on the human body, is made out of cartilage. Made out of cartilage. And so with that, now the orbital is incredibly hard, and I'm going to give you sort of like a technique to use for that very portion. So I'm going to skip it now so that we can do the easy portions. When you look at the anterior view of the inside of the nose, you are seeing a top half, you are seeing a bottom half. The top half is this bone that is embedded so deep that you can see it from the eye socket. You can also see it from the nasal cavity, and in a little bit you'll notice it's green. That's the whole entire bone. This is called the ethmoid bone, and you can see it from these views, and also you can see it from the bottom if you remove the mandible, and you can even see it from the very top. You can see it here, a little piece of it here. So it's embedded deeply within. So for the ethmoid bone, I want you all to sort of remember to look at colored skull. To look at the colored skull. And let me show you first before I write anything. And so, here. Where's this? All right, so as you're looking at this, right, we're looking at this portion of the skull. You can see that this is the maxilla, this is the maxilla, and so embedded deeply within is that ethmoid bone, spelled right there. It's kind of hard to make out, isn't it? Right, I think it's backwards too, inverted. But that gray one, let me get my stylus. This gray one, and I took pictures of this skull, so you actually already have it in your module if you want it. But otherwise, it is right here. That is your ethmoid bone here, ethmoid bone. And so you can see that it's embedded so deep, you can see it from the eye socket. You can see it from the nose. This is that same gray color right here. And then also, if I were to remove this skull cap here, or we were to see it from a superior view, and this is what houses the brain. And so you can also see it from the very top. So it's a tough bone. You want to make sure to take some time before you leave class to just look at ethmoid bone. If anything, before you leave class today, you should tell yourself, I need to know where my ethmoid bone is. It is so hard to remember this bone that I would start there, ethmoid bone. And so, actually, let's stay on this. And so in the skull, there's also going to be, the ethmoid bone's going to have this structure that you can see from the nose. This is called the perpendicular plate. Perpendicular plate. And then it's running straight down. And you'll notice my model here has a deviated septum here. It's kind of like twisted a little bit. But this should also be running upwards, like in your picture, like this. So it's this bottom portion right here. So this portion is perpendicular plate. This one is your vomer. So how to use this or worry about this on a test-taking technique is the top half. If they point to anything on the top half, you just assume it's part of the ethmoid bone. If they point to the bottom half, even though this picture is not drawn to scale like our models, if they point to the bottom half, I'll take the vomer. The vomer. And keep in mind that vomer is a bone. It's just this tiny little, tiny bone. It looks like as big as 2 guitar picks, something just about this long, and it only goes in one angle. It's very tiny, but it is its own bone. It doesn't have bone markings, but it is its own bone. And so here is our perpendicular plate. And this perpendicular plate serves to separate your nostrils into 2 left sides. It creates this unique cavernous system, right? Like a little system that creates a nice little turbulence. And I don't know if any of you know this about your nose, but you have a feature in your nose that when you breathe through your nose, you actually condition the air to your body temperature. That means that when you breathe in through your nose, by the time that air reaches your lungs, it's already your body temperature. But you lose those features if you're a mouth breather. So that happens because you have these intricate systems of blood vessels just pretty much anchored and leading out of this space onto the skin. And so they're just warming and humidifying air for you as you breathe in. And so with that. And let's see. Started up there. Do not worry about palatine bone on this viewpoint. You will worry about it in a different viewpoint. I would just put a little asterisk and tell yourself inferior view. No one's that mean to ask it from this view. Lacrimal bone, don't forget, that's going to be the segment that you see here where our tear ducts drain into. And as an FYI, you know, your tears actually produce from the top here. They fall through your eyes like this. They roll through your eyes. And that little lacrimal canal, that groove, is actually there to drain the tears into your nose. That's why you'll notice if you're ever crying, what probably is following? You're like, your nose is dripping, right? You got like mucus coming out, or like that's because the fluid is draining into that canal like a little sewage system into your nose. And so, next, anything I am missing now? Ask away.
I've heard someone that like the nose, if you have like a superior nostril, like you'll like and it switches throughout the day.
Yeah. I actually was going to look that up this morning, because I woke up and I was like, am I only breathing through one side? And I remember hearing about that. It alternates. But I have to double check that. Before I say anything. I think so too. I remember that you're only breathing through one at any given moment. Yeah, you are. Yeah, but I don't remember what controls it or why. And then I'll get back to you on all that, because I was actually pretty curious about that myself. And so with that, when we look now at our mandible, you'll see a little opening. Remember that the chin was called what? Mental. So the opening is easily called mental foramen, a hole in the mental region. And this is going to be, and the way to use your notes is that everything that's written there is essentially a structure you have to know. Sometimes they emphasize, or they do every single time, they write the bone name without anything. And if they gave you a bone marking, they write the bone it belongs to right underneath. Now, where we see the exception is that sometimes some structures it's too difficult to give you that. Because if you look at this structure here, or this opening, it's not really a structure, right? It's an opening. It's a fissure. And so this fissure is an opening that you can see in the skull. And so this opening is called inferior orbital fissure. And you'll notice it doesn't have a little parentheses. And the reason is because it's not coming from this cheekbone, the zygomatic bone. It's not coming from the maxilla bone. It's not coming from the sphenoid bone. It's actually a combination of all three bones. So we can't really give you a bone name for this. But it is a feature of the skull. So it's called the inferior orbital fissure. So it's best just to take everything very, very slowly. And in that same theme, we have these fissures here. And this larger one is going to be your superior orbital fissure. We have one more opening, and this opening is going to be called the optic canal, or the optic foramen. And that's going to be the opening that you see. So right now, try to look for those three openings. You should expect three. Find the bottom one, I think, is the easiest one to find. And they're not going to look exactly like this photo. So let's take out this camera again. And so this one has color, so I don't want to use the color to confuse you. But you can see that if you look at it, and it's also a little separated, but otherwise the one on the bottom, inferior, and the larger one, superior. And do you see that little hole right there? That specific hole is your optic canal. So you should expect three. The optic canal is a very clear opening. If it looks like anything other than a hole, it's a fissure. So fissure and fissure. Inferior orbital fissure, superior orbital fissure, and the little hole, optic foramen. Optic foramen. Oh, wrong thing. And that's the anterior view. So this one's you're probably gonna spend some time on this one, and I would imagine. And so let's keep it going to the inferior view. So as we look at this portion, the last bone I want to address, this is the second toughest bone. The ethmoid bone, I think, is one of the toughest. The second hardest is the sphenoid bone. And that's because it's another bone that's embedded. You can see it's the purple one that you're seeing. All the purple on this image is the sphenoid bone. They only put a little marking here, but it's actually this part, it's this part, it's this part, and again, this part. This is nasal bone. Don't confuse it for this purple. This is the nasal bone. You do not care about that part. But otherwise, here, 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 and here. And so, let's move forward. When we look at an inferior view, I don't think you might be able to do this with all your skulls, or you should be able to, is that you should gently, if you can, you should be able to remove the mandible, and you should be able to look at the upper jaw, When you look at your upper jaw, this is going to be called your maxilla, the entire thing, you in the front on top. And this is the part, if you grab your tongue, or use your tongue right now, and then you trace it on the roof of your mouth, trace it all the way to the very back, eventually you reach a very soft portion that just feels very soft. You can even push your tongue up a little bit more. If you drag your tongue, you've made it the way all the way here, and when you make it to the very back here, you made it to that little soft part. All right? And so this portion here, 2/3 of it, is the maxilla. The last little portion is your palatine bone. Palatine bone.
The ones under the spikes?
Yes, the last bit of it. The last bit. The spikes are the end of it. Those little spikes. If we look at a photo here, and let's compare it to your skulls. I don't know if I could remove this portion here. Yeah, I can remove this one. And so with color, this is what it perfectly looks like. So you don't have this in your box, but I'll leave this up so you can see it. It's even written there for you, palatine. You can see about 2/3 maxilla, and the maxilla also includes the front of the face here of the upper jaw. And the palatine bones are only the last about 1/4, 1/3. Hard to make out how much, but 1/4 I would say. And so that's the palatine color. All right. And so let's move on. And so there are a bunch of openings, but I'm going to give you a technique for these openings, because if you see, the skull has a bunch of holes. Even as you look at the inferior part of your skull, you're just going to see a bunch of openings. And this viewpoint is not my favorite to get you all to understand them in an easy way. So we're going to put a pin in it, and then we're going to come back to those foramen next when we're done with the bones of the skull. So when we look at this segment here, you can see this is the same occipital bone that we saw beforehand, and these were the occipital condyles, and the occipital condyle is going to meet the first cervical bone, and so the word condyle means a meeting site. That's all we need to know it as for our class, meeting site. Because you will see this word over and over again, condyle. So it becomes a term to log away. And so it's a meeting site on the occipital bone. So it's called, just this little piece is called the occipital condyle. And this is going to be like the attachment site for C1 bone, right? That's going to follow it. And then we can see this huge opening that's called foramen magnum for obvious reasons. Magnum means huge or large, and foramen means opening. And so this is like saying huge opening. And then you're going to see all of these openings are going to have that in common. Foramen, foramen, foramen. So if you see an opening and you don't remember the name on the exam, you better at least write foramen for half credit, because you'll be missing probably the other name. But if you see an opening, you can actually preserve some points if you just write foramen for some of them. And then there's only going to be one, I believe, that isn't going to follow that trend, but we'll get to it when we get to it. And now, time to address the openings. But first, the last bone we need to address. This bone is called the sphenoid bone. And this, the way to spell it or pronounce it, think of S, think of F, and then noid. Sphenoid. Actually, sphenoid. Sphenoid. Yeah, sphenoid. Sphe with an E. Yeah, sphenoid. Just pretend it's enough. Sphenoid. There you go. Just pretend it's enough. And then so the sphenoid bone is going to give rise to all those openings. And again, those openings are better if we learn them all together. I'll show you a little map technique. But otherwise, this is the hardest bone after the ethmoid bone because it's also buried deep within the skull. If you remove the skull cap, you can see this bat-like looking object here. And yours doesn't have color, and that's why I do want you all at some point to circulate the skull, or I'll circulate it around when I'm done talking here, so that you can see and verify where the sphenoid bone is for the weekend. Oops. So that you can see here where the sphenoid bone is. When you look at a superficial view, right, this is going to be right superficial. We're looking inside. It's buried within all of them, but you can see it on the front here. You can see it on the top, and if I were able to remove this maxilla, you can see it from the bottom. So it's a really hard bone because it's all these bones we learned about, they sort of, if it's the center, they just collapse on it. It's like in the very dead center. And so it has some unique features, such as a large wing. And so the way to find it without color is that you want to sort of remember or notice that there's this top portion where I have the writing here, sphenoid bone. And so if you go down, you can go into the skull downwards. It's so hard to navigate in reverse. This is the greater wing. The one on top, the lesser wing. So this is the lesser wing, greater wing. Lesser wing, greater wing. And so what it should roughly look like in your heads is something like this. This is what the image you're trying to extract out of the skull there. It looks like a little bat wing, like a little bat-winged creature, right? And so if you look at it here, this is it out of its segment. So this little portion that I mentioned right now, the portion up top, the higher part, is called the lesser wing. The one at the very bottom, the larger portion at the very bottom, is going to be the greater wing. And I wish I would have used a different color here. Greater wing. Greater wing. So it does look like, that's why I say the bat wings, to help you remember wings. The one on top, lesser wing. The one at the bottom, greater wing. And so, we'll evaluate the rest of the bone a little bit after. And so, time to discuss how you're going to learn these openings. And then we're going to break apart sort of the more complicated bones. We're going to separate them out like we just saw. But we got to learn these openings. And I'm trying to think what's fastest to do. I think it's actually faster if I keep going, or more logically easier. Yeah, let's actually finish up, and then I'll actually use your yellow packet and we'll make a map out of it. And so, there's a structure here to go over still here. This is a bone marking of the sphenoid bone. There's a typo here. This is misspelled, sphenoid. And this little portion here, this little dip, is called the sella turcica. This is where your pituitary gland sits, the thing that controls the hormones that are going to regulate the ovaries or the testes. In the endocrine system, there's a little gland that sits right there. And even the word, or this word, roughly translates to a throne. So it's like where the master pituitary gland sits is right there on its little throne. Anything else here to add? All right. And then I will deliver on this form, and I'll show you how to learn these easily, because learning them one at a time is terrible. It's easier to sort of remember a little mental map to help you with that. So let's move on and finish up the rest of the skull, and then we'll start that. And so now what are we looking at here? We have a sagittal view of the skull, meaning we sliced it in a sagittal view, and then we're taking one portion of this away so that we can see inside. This is where the brain will be housed. Here you're seeing where we left off. Here's that sphenoid bone. Here's our temporal bone, parietal bone, frontal bone, occipital bone. And so what do we see is a little empty pocket spaces. Here you can see these spaces are all going to share the name sinus, and one more. There should be one more. Oh, I guess you don't have to know the maxillary sinus. All right, never mind. You don't have to know the other sinus. There's frontal sinus and sphenoidal sinus, simply called because you can see it, an opening here in the frontal. And there's nothing in here. There's nothing but tissue part, and tissue and gases. And this helps with a little bit of mucus production, and also regulates pressure, or intracranial pressure. And so that's why when you hear, oh, I have a sinus headache, is because you have pressure in those particular spaces. That's why you'll see people doing this sometimes. Well, they'll do this to help their headache. And that's because they're trying to sort of release the pressure off of their frontal sinus, and then the maxillary sinus, but you don't need to know that one because I don't really think you can reach your sphenoidal sinus. This one is going to be really deep within the skull, but you won't really find the maxillary sinus on this photo. And it exists, but it's not even on your list, so don't worry about it. And other than that, there's nothing else. Oh, there's one last quick little thing. You don't have to flip pages. This was called the external auditory meatus. If we were to magic school bus our way into this opening and travel through where sound is traveling through, we would exit out right here. We would exit out through the internal acoustic meatus. So it's the same term, the same structure, but that's the inside of the tunnel, and then there's the outside of the tunnel. And so the inside, you just swap the name to internal, but it's the same ear hole in a way, but it's just the inside of it. And so with that, I think we got every bone. And this is that famous vomer that I mentioned. I told you to remember to separate these portions here into two segments, perpendicular plate, and then the bottom one, vomer. And so this vomer bone is best seen from the sagittal view. And so you're seeing here your vomer, and this is the shape of it. It looks like a sharp little chisel in a way, and it's right above or underneath that perpendicular plate of your ethmoid bone. And then here's that styloid process one more time, that little pointy part. This word's going to come up again, and it always means sort of like a pointed object in a way, pointed object. And I think I got everything on this slide. Let's keep it going. Now, let's open up take out your yellow packets. If you don't have one, let me know. I have more over here. Oh, yes, I gave it out. This one.
Oh, I have it.
Oh, you have this one? Okay. And I think that's it for everybody. And so, try roughly to sketch all of this out. This is the segment we have to focus on to really conclude this class. Because today we go over this skull. The next class we're going to go over a limb, or the video that you're going to go over on your lab for your tomorrow, since we're not going to have lab tomorrow. The video will be on the arm, and you'll be able to learn it with just your packet, and then when you come in, you'll be able to evaluate it in person. And so today we're going to go over the skull and finish the skull. So I want you to have these well marked on your packet. And so first thing we're going to do is we're going to focus on our ethmoid bone, which I traced in green. If you need colors, there's colored pencils or crayons on that left side over there on the table. And they should be on the table itself if you'd like some. And make sure. This crayon and this crayon. Yes. And again, I can give you another packet. I do have extras if you want to take some home. So you can do this at home as well. And I put the PDF so you can print out at home anything you like as well. And so if you're all sitting down, you want to get these structures. And try to keep in mind that this is a bone mark. These are bone marking. This one's a bone marking. If you see BM, it means bone marking. And then if it says bone, it's the bone. So those are bone markings of the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is essentially has little pores on it. And these pores send all these nerves into your nasal cavity. And that's how you smell things. Those molecules travel into the they're recognized by the receptors inside your nose, and the signals travel into the brain through the ethmoid bone. And that's what makes it very special, is that it's really where smell receptors go through. And it has a little bit of an organization to it. It has this middle portion that separates a left and a right. And in this instance, this is left, this is right. And so this yellow one that you're seeing is crista galli. That's the center divider. And the bone, the rest of it, both sides, is something called the cribiform plate. Cribiform plate. And so it's on both sides. The purple is cribiform plate, separated by the crista galli. Those are pretty tough ones to learn, I think. That's why we're spending some time on these. All right. And as you're doing so, I'll leave it up so you can see wherever you might be at. Okay. And as you're doing that, try to also trace the sphenoid bone as I have in orange here. Try to trace it because that is your sphenoid bone. Let me say one more time. Oh, bone marking.
Oh.
Yes. So one more time, this is bone markings to imply that these are features of the ethmoid bone. Because again, the ethmoid bone is the entire thing, but these are components of the ethmoid bone. Components. And so, our first opening that we're going to learn about are the optic canals. You can even call them optic foramen if you like. Is that something? Yeah, no, just canal. OC. OC. Optic canal. Optic canal. Pardon? And those are supposed to be little openings, but it's in black and white and it's two-dimensional, it's really hard to make it out. But those are little openings. That's why I drew little circles and little arrows to imply the optic canal.
The orange one's a sphenoid, right?
The orange is the sphenoid bone, yes, the bones. Sphenoid bone, not a barking, but the bones. These are bone markings of the sphenoid bone because they're like within the range of the bone, right? Everything within the orange are bone markings of the sphenoid bone. And so we always start here with the optic canal and the sella turcica, and then this is the cheat sheet we're going to use to find the openings all in a little map, like kind of looking like at a map on a land in a way. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. Oops, careful. And so I'm going to create a copy of this. Copy page. Copied. Or what happened? Can I duplicate? Which one are you looking for? The blue one is Sella turcica. S-E-L-L-A. And then that's an R. Turcica. 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 Yes, bone markings of the sphenoid bone. Think of when we say bone, it's like thinking about the states, like a state like California, and every state has counties or cities. And so the boundary of the orange is the sphenoid bone. Anything within that state, so to speak, are going to be like the cities. This is city optic canal. This entire kit is the county sella turcica, in a way. Yes. Little hard, weird way of learning it. But otherwise, they're features of the sphenoid bone. They're found on the sphenoid bone. And so with that, yes, and I'll leave this up in a second. We'll need it again anyways. And I just want to see if I copied the page correctly. I just don't know where it went. How do I... Perfect. Got it. Okay, sorry. There you go. I mean, sorry. It's on the large. There we go. And so those are the ones we've learned so far. Optic canals were those little openings that came out of the front of the orbital, the little hole that was above the fissure. And it's the one that I really want you to start really learning. If we learn anything today, it has to be that optic canal. It's the first thing. All right. And then this is on the recording, so don't worry if you miss anything. You can get it, but we have to move on to the openings, and I'll put this up for you one more time. And so I'm going to have to get comfortable here for this. All right. So I'm going to give you the idea of what I'm doing. Sorry, here. Back to good notes. Oh, yes, good notes. Here. Is that we have this viewpoint right now. Then this is that word that we were trying to write right there, sella turcica. And so sella turcica, I had you square it up. And so there was a word that we added. I added to your paper, but you can see them here. They're your optic canals, roughly around this red. Optic canals. This is what you highlighted on yours, optic canal. And so if you look at the name of each one of these openings, here are the openings in question that we're talking about. And so what I'm going to do is I'm creating a map in my head to help me remember the first letter. So if we look at the letters, we have R, we have L, we have O, we have S, and then we have J. And then this one, I even abbreviate this one for us, I-A-M. All right, so it's just the first letter. You can make sense of it with your packet in a little bit. All right, so back to what we were at. Skeleton handout. And I made a copy? Yes. And so starting with our OC, right? OC, that's optic canal. And I want you to visualize this. Actually, let's actually make it. Let me see if I can do it on the side here. OC. OC. Oval. Oval. Spinosum. And then we have rotundum. And then we have lacerum. And then we have carotid canal, CC. And so these are the names, but what I always remember instead is I write something like this on my paper, or I think about it in my head. Oh, dang, I already had it. R, and then just to make double check it, yes. And then we go O, S, and then L, C, C. And then it repeats itself on the other side. I'll show you 1 second what this is. O, C, R, O, S, and then L, and C, C. And I think I put it in the wrong way, sorry. Here we go, L and CC. And these are the letters. They represent the word itself. Like, for example, optic canal, rotundum, oval, spinosum, lacerum, carotid canal. And all I do is I sort of hold on to this visual because all I got to do is follow it like a map. Even if it's not there, we start off here, again, one more time. Here, OC, R, O, S, L, C, C. And you can find it on the skull the same exact way. And the best clue you want to use what you already know in your head. Oval sounds like what shape? Oval. Oval. And this one looks very oval. Even on your skull, as you look at it, you can see it right away. And the one that follows looks like a perfect little circle. Spinosum always looks like a perfect circle. And so when you look inside, or your skulls, which I do challenge you all to do, is that when you look at it, you will see clearly your oval one. You can just see it clear as day on that sphenoid bone. And so on your test, you're welcome to write this somewhere along the back or the right, so that way you can just count it. It works like a map. And then so you really can just remember the progression of the actual openings. And so you can see OC, ROS, LCC. And then I'm pretty fortunate. My last name is R-O-S-A, like Rosa, like a rose in Spanish. So it's easy because it's R-O-S, and then my first name is Luis. So it was always pretty easy. And then I just assume that the A is replaced by credit card or CC. And I know it's silly, but otherwise, that's the way I remember it. I don't know how you're going to remember it, but for me it helps to remember my name. Rose, and then without the A, just CC instead. So it's like my abbreviated first letter. And this one's just OC. I just remember it. Optic canals in the front of the face, right? Where your eyeballs are at. So it's your optic canal. And so you should be able to do the same thing on the other side, because if you know one side, you know the other side. And so this is the most difficult part of the skull. But if you've understood me so far, honestly, then you're well off. Then it won't be that bad. All right, and it's not over because we still have some terms to add. And I'm going to do something a little odd. I'm going to put this highlight here. Can I copy this and make it smaller? Yes. Can I move it? Yeah. And let's move it a little higher up. Let's grab this one more time. And let me move it up. There we go. And back to what I was doing. And then I create a border. You don't need to know the name of this part, but this is called the petrous part of the skull. It's not on your list. I don't think it is. And if you look at the inside of your skull, it's the part that's like a little cliff that goes up and down. You can pinch it. And let me show you on the camera. Petrous part. Again, it's just easy. Pretend it's like a map. And so here we are. Back to flip. And so as you look at the skull, which one's our oval one? Do you already see it by any chance? You see it right there, right there? Oval. And it's missing spinosum. This one actually is missing spinosum, but if you actually looked at any of your skulls, they do not have it. This is the only skull that's missing spinosum because it tries to have... Oh, perfect. It tries to have... Yeah, both of them do. And so the regular ones that you have should have spinosum, and I'll show you in a sec. But first, what was I going to show you? Oh, yeah. When you look at this part, this is that petrous part because all those letters ended there, O-S, and then lacerum. And so with my pointer, you can see oval, spinosum should be there. We can pretend that little opening is. And then lacerum is going back to the center. And then what's the one right next to lacerum? CC. And so right after that, the other openings are going to be above this portion. This is called the petrous portion. You can pinch it. On all your skulls, you can literally just look at it. And this part that you can just pinch. That's what I mean by the little hill. That's going to be your next major landmark. Even though you don't need to know the name, you just need to be able to see it. And that'll help you with the rest of the map. And I'm just going to double check it to make sure that I didn't say anything wrong. Okay. And we're going to do it on this side because this one's clear. This portion is going to be the I-A-M. And here you're going to have to draw it on this side. I don't know why this handout didn't have it. So I'm going to try my best to draw it. Ah, dang it. How am I going to draw this? Here, like this. It's sort of, this is the black hole. I'm going to put it right here. Like this. And so this is like going uphill. And then this is going downhill. And yes, that one's going to be internal acoustic meatus. The inner ear hole, so to speak. But that's not what you're going to say on the exam. Internal acoustic meatus. And then you have this bean-shaped one. This is going to be your jugular foramen in this little space right here. Also this little space right here. Jugular foramen. J, F. This one over here is going to be your I-A-M as well. And there is one more term, but you don't care for it. This is going to be your hypoglossal canal, but this campus doesn't ask it. So you do not need to worry about this opening. Don't confuse your packet. Don't confuse it on your packets. And then finally, what's that huge opening called? You got it. And so we finish our concept map here. We have IAM. After we go up that hill, IAM, jugular foramen, and then finally foramen magnum is at the center of all of this. We go IAM, jugular foramen in that order, and then there's only one foramen magnum. And so this is the map. I typically just remember one side, and I remember to sort of superimpose it on the other side, but I wrote it out so that way you can see it together. And the last little bit of danger, a thing I'm worried about is lacerum and carotid canal are, they're pretty much attached to each other. Lacerum you can see through the bottom of the skull. The carotid canal, now let me give you a difference too, now maybe you've noticed it now. It's either going to be called a foramen or a canal. What's the difference? A foramen, if I were to grab the skull right now, I can see you all through this opening. And I can do the exact same thing with all the other ones. All of these, I can see you. If I look for the oval, I'm looking at the oval, and I can see you. It's hard, but I can see you. Canal is different. Canal is like a gopher that buries within the skull in a way. And so you can't really see a canal. When you look at the entry of a canal, you can't see the exit because it's tunneling through the skull. And so that's the big difference between canal and foramen. And so this is more typically called an optic foramen or optic canal because it does bury through the skull. It is a little bit long, but just better to call it canal because it does bury through the skull. Foramens are just an opening. And then canal would be like a tunnel. Like still circle, but it's a tunnel. Kind of like a paper towel. Like this is a foramen, just my fingers like this, foramen. And then a tunnel, like a paper towel roll, the inside of it would be an example of a canal, right? It's like something you can travel through. And so that's the difference. So when you look at this one, lacerum, foramen lacerum, you're going to be able to see an opening, but then you're going to see the carotid canals directly attached to it, and it's pretty much going to be going sideways into the skull. And it exits on a different part of the skull, at the bottom. And so this is the hardest part of the skull. The rest of it will be the easiest thing you do, but this is the hardest part, is these openings. And the way it's going to be asked on the exam, because I want you to be well prepared, is that as you look at this portion, when they want to ask you for an opening, let's find our foramen lacerum. That's going to be that foramen oval. We can already see it on that white backdrop right about here. And then the way they're going to ask it is that they're going to place one of these inside. Oh, let me put it in the other one. Sorry, I forgot to reverse here. They're going to put it inside, and they'll ask you ID bone marking. And then they'll put red, they'll give a color of this in the red little pipe cleaner, the red little twig. And that's how they ask it. That's how they ask all the foramens. They'll put one of these in there, and even from the front, right? And then we should know, what's that little tiny little hole right here? Mm-mm. The one where the eye comes out from? Oh, sorry, the eye nerve comes out from? Optic canal. So this little opening is your optic canal. And then even the fissures, if they want to ask you for a fissure, they'll put a little pipe cleaner inside of it, and then they'll say, what is that fissure there? And that would be the inferior orbital fissure. Exactly. And if they can fit it into some of these, they might. But I think they'll just might point to it. Depends on how large it is. All right. And that is essentially the toughest part of the skull. And let's see where we're at on our notes. And does anybody need this photo still? No? Are we good here? Okay. And then also, does anybody need this one more time just to clean up anything? Yes. And then I'll give you all the 30 seconds to a minute. And again, this will be on the recording. And so some of you will have to speed it up or just fast forward when you want to get to the good parts. But it's all good parts. So. This exam is next week, Thursday. So over the weekend, this has to be done. And let's double check that date. Yes? It's going to be the entire skeleton. Yes. Your exam is on Thursday, lab exam 2, next Thursday on the 6th. On the 6th. Today's your first day for bone. And then, but this is the hardest part. The skull is the hardest. Everything else will be more simple to learn as opposed to the skull.
So knowing this one part packet will be fair with us.
Yes. Yes.
And
And
is it just gonna be on bones or anything else?
only bones.
Okay.
Only, yes, exactly. And then, so one last thing to add. You might have looked at your list and it looks like this. And so as you look at this portion, you'll see the functions of the cranial. This is just a repeat of everything. And it just gives you descriptions of just sort of how to compare it, little helpful memory things that you can use. But you don't need to know the functions of any of this. You just need to be able to ID the bones, the bone markings, the joints, and if it asks you if it's left or right, that's really it. And so it really ends right here. It ends right here on page 5. Page 5 is the end. Yes, none of that. Yes, none of that. Only what's on this list matters. And I do promise the rest of it is a lot easier. You've done the hardest part today. The hardest part. The vertebra might be a little tough, but it's not. It's hard at first. And what do we think that little opening is right here at the very top, right here on the frontal bone?
Is it that credit here in the
The frontal sinus. This is the frontal sinus. The frontal sinus. Your skulls might be able to, you might have that on your skulls as well. And once you get good at seeing the openings from the outside, you must learn the openings from the bottom as well. But you can already see, where's our oval one? Is it this little thing over here? This over here? This one? Yes, this one. This is a little oval shape. It's the most obvious one. Spinosum, again, your little our animations might be a little off or on this diagram. But just, here's the spinosum right here. This is spinosum right here. You can see it's a little tiny opening. Oh, yes. And so it's not the perfect packet, but it is a good way to study. Now I have one more tool for all of you to use that I need to share with you now. Is that it's going to be just like those simulators that I made for you. And so it works exactly the same way, no spaces, all lowercase, and it's to help you practice spelling, and they are in 3D. And so what you can do with this is that when you look at them, you can actually rotate the skull and do stuff around it, and you can zoom in. On tablet, you can zoom in a little bit like this. It's a little easier to use on tablet, but if you're gonna be at home with a laptop or a computer, use Chrome browser or Firefox. If you forget any of that, just read through this once and you'll get the gist. And then otherwise, you can actually download these, or you can take screenshots and save them so you don't have to go through the program. And then these are terms that you can be asked. For example, what is this bone over here? I know we're still learning it. What is it? Parietal. What's the one on the very back? Occipital. So you can see, pay attention to the phrase of the question. Identify the bone. So you are answering bone for H. Let's find H. What do we call this one here? This one's tough. Let's click it, and if you click it, it'll highlight it in yellow, and then you can rotate and sort of get a good. See, the second you saw and rotate, you were able to tell sphenoid bone. Yes, sphenoid bone. And so I'm gonna create. There's one more I have to add where you can actually just click it, and it probably just tells you what the bone is at least. But I don't know if I'll be able to get that to work by then. But otherwise, you can see all the bones. And if you want to get rid of some bones, click it like exactly like that, highlight in yellow, and then like this, for example. Oops. And then press delete, and it'll get rid of it so you can see anything on the inside. And then there'll be questions in separate sections. You don't have to do it for this one, but you can see it now, that you can see those openings, and we can see it'll ask you in the right angle, so you don't have to be rotating it as often. And then it'll say, what is this hole right here? Foramen ovale. What's the little tiny one right below it? Spinosum, right? And then so pay attention to the clue. You'll notice that I have like a clue. The hole means the hole. I can't put that little plus right in the middle. So just pay attention to what's in parentheses. I don't know why. And if you want to undo anything, you can just press reset or just backspace once to reset one action, and that's all. All right. And then so there'll be more for axial because vertebra is part of axial. So you might not be able to complete all of these perfectly just yet, but you can at least get the skull ones in. And I'll provide you some, maybe the pictures. But like I said, I would say just take screenshots of it. Like if you, when you zoom in, and again on the Chrome, it will be, probably won't do this as often, like the labels disappear on tablets for some reason. So I would recommend using your laptops at home. And then you'll be able to make it full screen. And then pay attention to the little clue. It'll say like the hole or the opening, and yes. And yes, and yes. And it works better on a, I think, a laptop or a PC or anything, just a computer desktop as opposed to a tablet. And again, use Firefox or Chrome. Yeah, see, this keeps happening. I do not know why. And also, it doesn't let you make it full screen, which is the other weird thing. You should be able to make it full screen everywhere. So I'll see how to fix that, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to fix that. I made these during COVID, so since I had to find a way to test students somehow, so I almost had a nervous breakdown. And yeah, so this is what I mean. You can take a picture of this segment, and then you can take a picture of this segment, and then you can sort of guesstimate. But again, just rely. Usually whenever you click on the question, it'll already zoom in on the viewpoint. You won't have to rotate it as much. And so you can get started on the rest, because as you progress through the rest of your notes,